Hello and welcome to another episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. Today we are doing one of our throwback episodes where we highlight some of our previous work that you might not have heard about. So this episode is a shortened version of an event recorded for the Therapist Connect birthday in January. If you'd like to hear the full version of this episode, then you can search for us via our YouTube account, where we have lots of other discussions, debates and interviews there waiting for you. In this episode, Caz Binstead, Therapist Connect co-lead, talks to the editors and book chapter authors of Therapists Challenging Racism and Oppression, The Unheard Voices. And I'll let Caz do the full introductions.
I'm blessed to be here with the editors of the book, Neelam and Rachel. Hello.
Hi,
Caz. Great to be here. Thank you.
To have you here. So I'm actually just going to start by reading the blurb for the book for anyone who doesn't have any idea of what it's about. So this book is about racism and its intersections with other forms of oppression within the talking therapies professions, told from the therapist perspective. These rarely heard voices speak honestly of the pain of being silenced, shamed, excluded, violated, rendered invisible, and deeply wounded by their experiences in training and in practice. But there are also stories of strength, courage, resourcefulness, and growth. Some therapists may find recognition and affirmation in these accounts, as well as hope and healing. Others may better understand how their own fragility and bias have led them to similar behaviours and harmful mistakes. This essential read brings together personal, psychological, societal, and political insights to better imagine and further the discourse around what might facilitate meaningful change. Just to properly introduce you, I'm just going to read your bios. Neelam Zahid is an integrative counsellor, psychotherapist and clinical supervisor accredited by BACP. She has practiced as a therapist since 2003, having previously worked in higher education for more than a decade, and currently has her own private practice. She is also deputy course leader for the foundation year at the Minster Centre and teaches on the Introduction to Counselling Skills course. In addition, she is currently a visiting lecturer at the University of Westminster, teaching on the BSc Psychology and Counselling and Introduction to Counselling Skills courses. Her area of interest are intersectionality, difference and diversity, and she has contributed to several publications, including the Handbook of Transcultural Counselling and Psychotherapy and Black Identities and White Therapies, Race, Respect and Diversity. And we have Rachel Jane Cooke, she, they, who's a queer integrative psychotherapist, supervisor and educator from Ireland in practice since 2009. She's based in London, runs an online therapy platform, consults to charities and social enterprises, and has a long-standing weekly radio segment on sex and relationships, where she often discusses identity, privilege, and oppression. She regularly speaks on podcasts and hosts talks and workshops for the public, for therapists and for organisations on topics such as intersectionality, trauma, attachment, health and wellness under neoliberalism, embodiment, feminist therapy and gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity. Rachel is passionate about training therapists committed to social justice, particularly through embodied and relational practice. And you can read more about her work at racheljanecooke.com.
I thought before we start going into the book and talking about our own chapters as well as the other chapters, I thought it'd be, or I felt it was important to kind of name the chapters, but also name our contributors so that they kind of have a space here, even though they may not be physically here. So I'll read through the contents page. And as I do this, I'm also mindful of the pronunciation of certain names that I'm unsure of. So Rachel, do jump in if I've mispronounced a name. And also if we collectively mispronounce the name, then I would encourage the contributor or someone else with that name to tell us what the right or correct pronunciation is. So I'll do my best here. And I suppose just want to say that in context of my own chapter, I think kind of the names part is quite important. So, but I know we'll go on to talk about that in a second. So the first couple of chapters is by myself. What's in a name? Why names matter for people of colour. The second chapter is by Rachel Cooke, cultivating intersectional nuance within the dissociative confines of capitalism. The next chapter is written by Ohema N. Kansa Dwamina. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Attending to self, attending to others, the impact on the Black therapist of client presentations of racial trauma. We then have Anita Gasper, Call Me By My Name. That's the following chapter. The one after that is by Joanna Trainer, A Need for Deep Learning, Not Training. Chapter 6, Racism and Coercive Control in an NHS Counselling Service by Anya Amrith and Roshmi Lovett. Chapter 7, Confronting the Colonial History of Transphobia by Sam Hope. Chapter 8, Interracial Transference, A Case of Projective Identification by Jaspreet Tahira or Tihara. Chapter 9, and I cannot pronounce this word. Go on, Rachel.
Biunital.
Thank you. Healing, a multi-dimensional approach to therapy by Oi Agoro. And the final chapter, chapter 10, My Journey to Visibility, Using Congruence to Explore Racial Microaggressions Within the Supervisory Relationship by Rajita Rajeshwar. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're not going to have a lot of time in this discussion to touch on all of the chapters, but we do want to acknowledge all those. To get started, you talk in the introduction in the book about the reasons for writing it and your own individual processes in that. So would you, just for the viewers, say a little bit about that?
Shall I jump in first, Rachel?
Kick us off, Neelam, please.
So for me, I think really this book has been a culmination of years and years of racism within the field of therapy. And from the time of my training up until now, there have always been different forms of experiencing racism within the field, whether it's as a client in the kind of client chair, whether it's as a therapist in the therapist chair, in training, my initial training with other peers or tutors or work colleagues. So for me, there's just been a list of one thing after another. And I think within the last kind of 5 or 6 years, for me, after having attended some workshops where that happened again, I felt like I really couldn't keep silent anymore. And yeah, it was just coming from that place of I really want to speak up about the racism within our field. And I don't think it gets talked about enough. For me, it's racism is out there and it happens out there in the outside world. And it's only now recently that we started thinking about it in terms of and in context of our therapeutic work. And I think that's why I wanted to break the silence around that. So for me, that's what the book has been really about, and to give a voice, not only to give myself a voice, but to give all of the other contributors and hopefully other people who will be reading this a voice to break the silence around racism within the field.
Rachel?
Yeah, follow on from that. I was really flattered and delighted to be asked by Neelam to support her in this project and to co-edit. It felt like a very synchronicitous sort of timing, very kind of rousing. It was 2019, 2020. And we both had separately, before we knew each other, just a lot of experiences, a huge amount from what Neelam has shared of experiences of trainings that were just poorly held in terms of like intersectionality and difference in general, but particularly around race. And so it felt like that was just incredibly needed. Far too many trainings that were just woefully ill-equipped in holding, diversity really, and approaching training with kind of true intersectionality. So what it's really made me think about is how therapy is political. It feels like we're only starting to really touch on what that means, that kind of everything is political or can be political, and how therapy has stayed apart from that for a long time in many ways, particularly white Western therapy. And through speaking to people and delving into this kind of area and topic, we discovered just so many therapists who've had horrific experiences in training, in organizations and institutions, organizations that they work with, in private practice with their own clients, in their own therapy and supervision. And so what we thought was going to be more of a, let's say, maybe handbook, I think, to begin with, ended up being a collection of stories, because it felt like we recognize that there are more spaces now for people to talk about race and racism, but we don't really know of any books and not many kind of podcasts or resources where therapists, particularly therapists of colour, have the opportunity to really speak about their own personal experiences and their kind of professional experiences with race. So it felt like my involvement, I really wanted to use my privilege and power to support therapists of colour to be heard and to be published. We wanted to get as many people on board who hadn't been published before, although some of them have been, and to just share the platform with different and similar kind of marginalizations. Because I guess through this, we've also recognised that nearly everybody has some aspect of their identity that is marginalised, but that doesn't make them all equal. And yeah, it was a real pleasure and honour to be able to be part of this project with Neelam and the amazing contributors that we have met, both all the people who've been published and also the ones who didn't end up making it into the book.
Neelam, what you say there about the silence, I think that's such an important point. We were talking about it off screen a moment ago. We are a talking profession, and actually being able to talk about these things and share stories and be human beings and share our stories. One thing I really love about this book, the fact that, like you say, Rachel, you decided to go down people's actual accounts and stories. I think it makes it a really powerful book.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a daring book. I was thinking about this just a couple of days ago, how much courage it takes to speak out within a profession where, although we are told to speak out and to be congruent and authentic and real, that actually there are certain things that we are encouraged almost not to. And I'm just thinking about the traditional psychotherapeutic model, where it just focuses on the internal system and our kind of internal space, and really divorce it from the external world. And as Rachel said, therapy is political, and it is really important to bring that into the room. And I feel like there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear within the therapy world of, what if we get found out? What if I say the wrong thing? What if? There's lots of what ifs. I've had conversations with lots of people who will say, I'm really afraid that I'll get it wrong and that somebody will call me racist. And I think that's what prevents us from speaking out. And it feels like a real representation of kind of what happens in the outside world, that fear of speaking out and breaking the silence. And it is an incongruence within our field of, as you say, it's a talking profession, and yet there's certain things that we're bracketing and not really being really tentative with.
Hugely. And I suppose, adding into just to that about the kind of the hierarchy that exists and how this book really made us look at. I was already interested in the concept of decolonizing therapy. In fact, I felt passionate about it. But again, it's something that only over the past few years are we really looking at how the kind of Western medical model has placed people suffering within the individual in kind of faulty neurochemicals and brains not working kind of thing, as opposed to being able to really look, which is not the same as saying that everything is about the fact that you grew up poor or working class or black or whatever it is, but it's recognizing that the context, the social context, your environments are going to have a huge impact on your well-being, what you believe is possible for your life, all of those things, and how you're what we call mental health, but I personally prefer psychosocial well-being or biopsychosocial, in order to really look at that context, because even the term mental health makes us think about that being localized in the individual, which we've discovered through these chapters and the research that we've done through this, that it's not helping us, and it's very part of a kind of capitalist and very kind of white historical cultural approach towards well-being and the kind of lack of community or separation from community in that individualization that has occurred.
I know you're going to say more about that, Rachel, when you talk about your chapter. In terms of the other authors, I know this has been quite a long process, actually, because obviously it happened over the pandemic period. How did you go about finding contributors? How did that kind of play out?
I suppose contacts of the networks, certainly for me, the kind of networks that we were or I was part of, and reaching out to people, calling for chapter contributions, personal networks as well. So it's really tapping into the kind of people I know and people that they know, and really trying to get people who, as Rachel said earlier, hadn't written anything before, hadn't been published, but really who felt like they wanted to tell their story. And that felt like a really important part, that this wasn't actually just an academic piece of work, because we had lots of people wanting to just write about theory. And this isn't just about theory. This is about real life, and this is about our experiences. So it was really, finding people who wanted to do that, wanting to really be vulnerable. And what we asked people to do wasn't easy. And I really recognized how much we asked from our contributors, the amount that they had to go into their own trauma, their own racial trauma, as well as other traumas. So the vulnerability, the courage that it took, it just felt, it was a really important part of this book, is being able to tell that story. But I think that's how we did it. And we had lots of people drop out as well along the way. For some people, it was things around practicalities, it didn't work out. For other people, it brought up lots of things for people. And I know for myself, it brought up lots of things for me, and it was just too difficult to do. And I'm so sure Rachel will say a bit more about that. But that's how we went about trying to find people.
My process was a little bit different, in that I was also reaching out to my network, but I also did quite a social media drive on that, where I approached some people, usually not cold, but there were a few people where I'd heard that this person might be interested, and then I approached them and said, hey, this is something that we're doing, and ended up with a lot of kind of conversations and contacts through that. But as Neelam touched on there or mentioned, we've had to try and balance how much are we going to be able to have the time, how much time and energy are we going to have ourselves with our own private practices and different Neelam teachers and the different things that we're doing, supervising, having our lives. Neelam's got children, and just being able to really do justice to the contributors, where we could have a really full mixture, where it wasn't about having a kind of tick box of every kind of marginalized identity, but we still wanted it to be as diverse as possible. But we had to recognize that we were, as Neelam said, asking a lot of the contributors, and also we wanted to be able to support them as much as possible. So there was this big process of how much do we share each time that we make a change with the book, each time that someone's chapter changes, or we had a rough idea of how many people from different particular backgrounds we would like, but that shifted over time. Some people dropped out because of the timing for them, because the project went on for nearly 3.5 years in total. And I certainly optimistically thought in the beginning that we would probably manage to get it published within about 18 months. And I think Neelam was much more realistic than I was. But that was also something where some people had written something earlier on, and then as time went on, that ended up being they were in a different place at that time. Later on, for other people, they came in right at the end and didn't have anywhere near as much time to be supported by us. And so each of those had a lot of kind of complexity and required having what I've come to see as having both thick skin and thin skin at the same time, like needing to be thin-skinned in remaining sensitive and really listening and being attentive to people's feedback, and also not wanting to overcrowd them with how much communication we were having or the way in which we were editing, but then also needing to be quite thick-skinned in how people, both contributors or people who even put in kind of proposals, were sometimes having reactions to, it could be me being involved as a white person, or what they felt that the book constituted, before knowing more about the book. So we had to really span that as well, which took that kind of time and energy and being as conscientious as we could be.
Mm. And actually, just to add on to that as well, that some of our requests were received with some annoyance and some anger, that we were asking people of colour to write about their racial trauma or the racist experiences that had been through for essentially not a fee. And as we all know, writing books, these kinds of books, academic books, there is no money to be made in this. We're not making millions at all. And there was that kind of, and rightly, I think, in some ways, of you're asking us to write about our racist experiences, and we're not getting anything in return for this, which I really do understand. And I suppose for me, it's like, yeah, actually, that is a massive thing to ask somebody. So I suppose someone had to be in I was going to say, in the right time in their life where they were able to share that part of themselves, for the greater good, so to speak, rather than be in a place, maybe more fragile or delicate place, or wherever they may have been. Yeah, those were some of the challenges as well that we came across when calling out to people and asking them to write.
Actually, as you both know, one of the reasons I really this book is because it's very like community. It's community activism in a book, which I think is just amazing. But as a community lead myself, I really identify with a lot of the things that you're saying there, Neelam, asking people, do you want to do things, but we can't pay you? But there's the pros to that, but then cons like that, asking people to give their time and things. But it also strikes me that there's a lot of difference between a book and your job as editors, where actually as editors, you have to be, because it's a book you're producing, you have to, Rachel, you were saying the thick skin, thin skin, a bit of wearing lots of different hats and things. So in some ways, that's even more of a challenge then, because you're giving space to people. But like you say, then it's not a closed space, it's an open space for the world.
Yeah, totally. We were trying to be everything to all people in some ways, and also having to manage that in ourselves, because I think certainly for me, I felt incredibly lucky that the way, even though Neelam and I worked quite different ways and we had different periods over the 3.5 years where one of us had more availability and more bandwidth than the other, and we worked quite differently in terms of how we edited. But for whatever reason, certainly speaking for myself, I feel incredibly grateful and appreciative that it overall felt like we really gelled. It doesn't mean there weren't times where we disagreed, but it felt like we were able to really be responsible for ourselves and to each other, which was an amazing part of the process, because considering we were having to have so many conversations about how much we would include contributors in different decisions and changes that were being made to the book, and holding all of those things around people dropping in and dropping out and all of that we were really lucky. I think that would have been an immensely different process to not have a co-editor or something like that.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. So is there anything else that either of you want to add? Anything we haven't talked about that you'd really like to mention? Or
I guess the final just note that I wanted to share was about, it goes back to the political aspect of this. Something that I've really noticed is the reticence of a lot of practitioners, and understandably for many different reasons. For some people it's frightening in private practice, for some people it's frightening working for the NHS or different organisations, but around speaking out against injustice. And I've seen that particularly with the kind of therapist silence around Palestine over the last few months, that it feels as though It's now becoming more accepted to call what's happening a genocide. And also, it's been really quite striking how little I've seen practitioners. Now, maybe there's lots of private discussions going on, but publicly, there's been very little so far. And I'm guessing that a lot of that is out of fear. But I think we're only beginning to find the language after 3 months of what's been happening there to be able to say that critiquing a government's choices is not the same as casting discrimination on a whole people or the people who live in that place. And that this is something that I really hope that we are going to be talking more about, because the silence has been pretty deafening.
Such important points. It comes back to, let's talk to each other. Let's remain open.
Yeah. And I suppose for me, and thank you, Rachel, for saying that. I think that's been a really, I feel deeply moved by what's happening in the world. And I think, it goes to a place of real hurt and upset. And I think for me, the work that we are doing, have done, if it's a stone in a pebble in that sea, that vast thing, then actually it's worth it. So for me, the vulnerability, the pain that we go through in the Western world, in kind of the UK that we live in, despite the choices of our government, that makes it worthwhile for me to open up and put this kind of piece of work out there. And so really a heartfelt thanks to all the contributors for putting themselves out there, for doing some of this kind of, and again, I'm struggling to say the words because I think it's important, it's difficult work, it's vulnerable work. And actually, I just want to say thank you to everyone for doing that. I think that's what I want to end with.
Stuff. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Here's the book. Go and buy it. You're going to definitely learn something. Thank you so much, Rachel and Neelam, for joining me today.
Thank you, Caz. Thanks for inviting us to speak today.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. It is a shortened version of an event recorded for the Therapist Connect birthday in January. So if you'd like to hear the full version of this episode, then you can search for it via our YouTube account, where we have lots of other discussions, debates and interviews waiting for you. If you'd like to support the podcast, then please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform.